Our story this morning comes from Luke, chapter 4, verses 16 through 21. In her book about the Passion, Amy Jill Levine says this about Jesus' act of love, washing the disciples' feet. To be a servant leader, to take on the role of a slave, also means to take on the role of freeing others, not only from sin, but also from bondage. Washing others' feet may seem shocking to us, but more out of a disdain for feet rather than the real reason it was shocking to those first disciples. Jesus' stature as a master teacher and honored guest made him first in line to be served, certainly not to be the servant. But if the disciples had been paying attention, they would have heard Jesus' own proclamation of his call to free those captive, especially the least among society. In taking the place of a slave, he shows forth the fulfillment of this role, one that will be further fulfilled in dying as a common criminal. We remember Jesus' words from an earlier time. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found a place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed upon him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing."
And now listen to this story. My master's banquet hall upstairs was booked for the night, and the time had arrived for the evening's group to come for the banquet. All was prepared according to their wishes, and I was ready with the water, the basin, as I always am. Years ago, my parents had given me to the owner for collateral for the debt they owed him. But things did not go well for them, and the debt had never been paid. And so I had to work to pay it off. Roman law says that someday I could be a free person, but I will never again have the full rights in society like those who have never been slaves. It is a mark for life. I keep my head down and do what my master asks, because legally he has the right to punish, abuse, humiliate me. I've witnessed it happen to others. Right now, I have no rights. So there I was with the bowl, just waiting for the go-ahead to start. It would be the honored guest first, of course, and I knew which one that was by where he was seated. It was all protocol. Everyone has a place according to status. When he showed up, I recognized him and remembered the stories that I had heard about this teacher. He was saying things that were really upsetting for those invested in this system of status. Saying things like, "The last shall be first." My friend, who serves in the kitchen, had to tell me to stop staring. I just couldn't imagine a world like he described. And then he came right up to me and took the basin of water from my hands. He took my servant's towel and wrapped it around his own waist and knelt, telling Peter to come sit down. This was going to be no ordinary night. I realized that my life, my view of myself, and my station in life was never going to be the same.
So today, on this Lenten Sunday, we imagine ourselves in the story of Jesus' last week yet again, and today we focus on the Lord's Supper. This, of course, is the story that initiates our ritual that we call the Lord's Supper. Sometimes we call it communion. Sometimes we call it the Eucharist. It is the same thing. So often, for so many, this is just a silly ritual. I shared with you in the past and in Bible study that there was a time when I was early in my Christianity. I would show up to church, I would sit in the back, I would grab a bulletin, I would open it up, I would see that it was Communion Sunday. I got up, I walked out the side door hoping that no one would notice how rude I was. But at the time, communion made absolutely no sense to me. It was this silly play that the church did for reasons that I didn't understand, but my gut was that this is a show of how pious this congregation is. And when I myself received communion, I felt like a phony. I felt like a phony because I felt like I was pretending to be spiritually nourished when really I was just looking at my watch trying to figure out when this would all end. Now I'm pretty certain that I'm not the only person who has ever felt that way. In fact, I'm quite certain that everybody has felt that way at one time or another. And honestly, even when I preside over these sacred elements, there are times, there are occasions when I wonder to myself, why do we do this? Karl Rahner is one of my favorite contemporary theologians. He's from Germany. And this is what he said about communion. Some things are understood not by grasping, but by allowing oneself to be grasped. I'm going to keep that up for a moment. Some things are understood not by grasping, but by allowing oneself to be grasped. So my prayer is that all of us, if not all the time, I don't think that's possible, but occasionally feel that you are grasped in communion. And churches and denominations all treat the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, communion differently. So, for example, some churches like the Lutherans have communion every single Sunday. Some churches have it every day, like the Catholic Church. Non-denominational churches generally don't have it at all, unless on occasion. So frequency is something that's different for faith communities. But also practices can be vastly different. So one congregation might dress up in formal garbs and robes, and there would be a very formal liturgy where the exact words have to be said over and over each Sunday, each time they have communion. It has to be the exact words of their liturgical practice. And then other churches, kind of like ours, maybe because this is the way I like it, maybe before I got here you were a little bit more formal, but there's this kind of free-for-all where communion can be another artistic expression of our faith. So not only the frequency and the practice are different, also the theologies. There's a lot of different theologies regarding communion, different interpretations of what the Lord's Supper is really about. What does it mean? How does it work? What's the point? In the past couple of Sundays, I've asked for audience participation. Audience. You're not an audience, by the way. But I really enjoyed that. I had a lot of fun with that. So I'm going to do it again. What is the point of communion? Centering. Sharing. Being one with God. Remembering. Having a conversation with Jesus. Honor. Connection. Reminder of dependence. My hunch is that your theology of communion will change throughout your lives. I hope it does. Because if you're stuck in one interpretation, you're not on the journey. You're stuck. Growth means that your understanding of what's happening in the Bible and in Jesus' life and in all these rituals develop as you develop. So as far as I'm concerned, where I am in my faith journey at this point in this day, I'll share with you my theology of communion. The point is, for me, that we are all hungry, that we all thirst, and we all need to eat and we all need to drink, otherwise we die. So in other words, to be a human is to be hungry, and not being able to be hungry is dead. So in Western culture, this is unfortunate. In Western culture, we have forgotten what hunger is, if we have ever experienced it all. And I'm not talking about a strict diet. For most of us, our bodies are satisfied continuously, and we even forget that hunger exists at all. And this is sad, because in a small way, the spiritual discipline of fasting is a reminder that humans are hungry. We are thirsty. In fact, hunger is painful, isn't it? Hunger is a painful experience. Thirst can be debilitating. And they are both experiences of urgent need. Food, feasts, banquets, bread, manna, vines, figs. All of them are constantly referenced in the biblical stories, both in the Hebrew text as well as the New Testament. Why? Our scriptures are stories of God, they're stories of us, and they're stories of our relationship, God and our relationship together. And so time and time and time again, as we read these biblical stories, the men, the women, the children in these biblical stories are hungry. They're thirsty. And time and time and time again, God provides. So, The scriptures may refer to our physical hunger, but perhaps more importantly, they suggest our spiritual hunger. Why did God create us with this insatiable appetite? What is the purpose of our being created? To be hungry and thirsty. Don't you think that the world would be a much more pleasant place if hunger and thirst were not part of the human experience? There's a great story that I want to share with you. A young student went to his spiritual teacher and he asked the question, "Master, how can I truly find God?" And the teacher asked him to accompany him to the river, which was along the town, the village. And when they got to the river, the teacher invited the student to come into the water with him. And when they got to the center, the middle of the stream, the teacher said, "Please immerse yourself in the water." The student did as he was instructed, whereupon the teacher put his hands on the student's head and he held him under the water. And the student began to struggle, and the master held him under the water. And a moment passed, and the student started to thrash and beating the water and beating the air with his arms, and the teacher continued to hold him under the water. Finally, the student was released, and he shot up out of the water, and he was gasping, his lungs were aching, and once he got a sense of, okay, I can breathe again, the teacher said this: "When you desire God as truly as you desired to breathe the air you just breathed, then you shall find God." Perhaps just like our need for air, our physical hunger and our thirst are meant to draw us into God's presence to satisfy our spiritual hunger. C.S. Lewis is one of my all-time favorite theologians. He was friends with J.R. Tolkien. He's the one who wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He also wrote a book called Mere Christianity. It is a phenomenal book. I highly recommend it. But in Mere Christianity, he notes this: creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's a thing such as water. And Lewis writes, if I find myself a desire that no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, then probably earthly pleasures were not meant to satisfy, but only to arouse, to suggest the real thing. Whether we are aware of it or not, whether we recognize our yearning for God or are oblivious, the truth is that hunger is a reality that each one of us can experience. And the story of feeding the 5,000 with a few loaves of bread and some smelly fish is foreshadowing the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, the banquet the feast, the Passover meal. And so in this story of the 5,000 people, which is in all four Gospels, Jesus, in that story, takes the bread. He blesses the bread. He breaks the bread. And he shares the bread. This isn't something that only happened at the Last Supper. It's a thing that he did throughout his ministry. Why? Because whether we know it or not, both physical and spiritual hunger are a human experience. And physical hunger draws us into Safeway. Spiritual hunger draws us into church, or a mountaintop, or a monastery, or wherever it is that you feel spiritually connected. So what is the purpose of the sacrament of coming to the Lord's table? It is meant to satisfy our deepest hunger. Because some things are understood not by grasping, but by being grasped. Amen.
Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full on his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his wonder and grace.